Okay, hello everyone and good morning. Also, it's afternoon where I'm speaking to you now from Singapore. Um, and I'm sending this video in advance just in case there's any technical glitches on the day, and it may be an easier way to do this. So I'd like to begin by expressing my thanks to Mustafa and his colleagues at the Dialogue Society in London for not just inviting me to deliver this keynote, but also for arranging this important and fascinating workshop at such a crucial time. When I agreed to do this keynote, I sought to imagine how I might make a contribution that would relate to the overall themes of the workshop, and I hope that in some small way, I'll be able to make some comments that will move in this direction over the next few minutes. The title I've given myself, you can see here, is perhaps rather grandiose in how it starts: Rethinking the possibility and meaning of dialogue, which is a huge task. But I hope that my subtitle frames this in a somewhat humbler and more manageable way, in providing what I have termed a mid-COVID perspective from Southeast Asia. Certainly, I do not hope to tear down and reformulate the many and varied things that dialogue may mean within the course of this short talk, but at least to offer some thoughts on directions that we might move in from one perspective and at one point in time. To this end, I will begin by reflecting briefly on a master's course that I teach here in Singapore, entitled Dialogue, Interreligious Encounters and Peace Building. Now, just last week, I finished my annual modifications to it in preparation for the new teaching year, which begins next month. And I noted around 20 key theorists who we would engage with during the course. And many will be familiar names to you, such as Buber, Levinas, Gadamer, Bohm, Habermas, and others. They may be expected in any course on dialogue, but this brief list is one of white, Western men, notwithstanding that by bringing insights from their Jewish heritage, both Buber and Levinas certainly disrupt in certain ways some of the mainstream discourse. Now, the theorists engaged in the course are not all white, Western or male by any means, and having taught the course for 5 years, I've sought to find ways to embed it more thoroughly within an Asian context. Nevertheless, there is a difficulty here because virtually all the mainstream literature on dialogue, including interreligious dialogue, which is the main focus of my course, rests upon a basis of the normativity of the Western canon. Indeed, in thinking of dialogue as a form, it is hard to go beyond accounts that begin with Plato and then take us through a mainly European set of texts, while in terms of such things as ethics and hermeneutics, the thinkers mentioned here predominate. Yet this limits us, it limits our vision. The Buddhist sutras, for instance, are also predominantly in dialogue form. Shakyamuni is in conversation with his disciples or other thinkers, and dialogue is a well-known Asian literary form. Again, when we look at important figures involved in dialogue in the world today and in recent times, we would have to acknowledge such figures as Fethullah Gulen and Daisetsu Ikeda, Turkish and Japanese, respectively. Yet, beyond the sterling work done by the Dialogue Society hosting us here, there are few studies of these figures within what may be termed dialogue studies as a whole. In academic terms, that they are both more practitioners rather than scholars means that their style of writing and speaking when it comes to dialogue may seem to lack the depth and rigour needed for them to be objects of serious study or capable of being considered as theorists, and so their ideas have not been widely taken up in the literature. We see here a recurring issue that scholars in decolonial studies have long noted, that due to the embedded nature of the supposed canon within the parameters of Western scholarship, to become what is seen as properly educated in the field means essentially studying the Western texts, norms, and classics. And then, once educated in this way, it is both hard to see other alternatives, while one is also invested in maintaining the status quo. For it is the long learning and study of these classics that gains one a certain pedigree of respectability as a scholar, and to make others scholars, one must be seen to teach and perpetuate the same canons of knowledge and norms. This process pushes out those who do not fit within these expectations. Here, I'd like to bring into thought of Walter Mignolo, particularly as he draws upon the Indian historian Partha Chatterjee and his concept of colonial difference, decolonial scholar Frantz Fanon and his concept, the wretched of the earth, and the Peruvian sociologist Gloria Evangelina Anzaldúa's conception of the colonial wound. I'll briefly unpack these ideas. Chatterjee noted that in ruling India, the British saw their understandings as being a universal template which could be applied anywhere. So, to fit it to India, it was necessary for India to be trained and taught to think like the British. Chatterjee suggested that this was a general rule applied by colonial rulers everywhere, which he termed the rule of the colonial difference. As a principle, the colonial difference is the fact that the colonized are forced to accept ideas, concepts, and ways of thinking which are not their own, but which are the dominant paradigms they must fit into. Meanwhile, Anzaldúa speaks about the cultural trauma of those who are colonized and so always have to live within a world where their language, culture, ways of life, etc. are subservient or inferior to the dominant modes of knowledge, speaking, and power production. Combining this with Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, Mignolo describes the matrix as such, and I quote, "So it is the colonial subaltern that carries on its shoulders the global colonial difference, the racialized colonial wound. They are what Frantz Fanon identified as les damnés de la terre, the wretched of the earth. What is the colonial difference and the colonial wound? To put it simply, it is the authority and legitimacy of Euro-centered epistemology from the left to the right, assuming or explicitly declaring the inferiority of non-Christian, coloured skin, of those not born speaking modern European languages, or who are born speaking a surrogate version of a European language, like in British India, Spanish America, the French Caribbean, etc., Singlish, as we would sort of have here. Now, the issue raised here for us by Mignolo, which I think has been lurking behind what I've said so far, is that the colonial difference is implicit for any subaltern group where the language termed in theory of the centre takes place as the canon. I might suggest that a field such as dialogue studies would consider itself in such a context. It might be one that seeks to overcome such fissures and differences, bridge building, to cross over to where the other stands and to understand them on their own terms, to give one rough and ready way of thinking about what dialogue may entail, may therefore be a way to move from the centre to the margins and also from the margins to the centre. After all, one cannot dialogue with another simply upon one's own terms, and so must engage the thought world of the other in the process. The norms and canon of dialogue must, of necessity, entail that we can move beyond a white Western male core to one that embraces wider diversity. This is not, of course, to decry or obliterate what has been given to us by the likes of Buber, Levinas, or Gadamer. And indeed, we can argue that the opening of horizons from the centres to the margin is inherent in their thinking. So our work of understanding must be an ongoing project. And I believe that the concept of dialogue advanced by somebody like the educationalist theorist Paulo Freire would give further support to what I argue. Now, with the time left to me, I cannot hope to develop what a theory or practice of dialogue would look like from within a Southeast Asian perspective. But I will sketch some thoughts in 3 steps, looking at how some of the traditions that meet in Southeast Asia may assist us in drawing out new paradigms. First, I'll turn to my notion around this being a mid-COVID context and community thinking in Asia with an eye to Confucian thought. Second, I'll discuss how Buddhist thought may give us a new angle on thinking of the ethics of dialogue. And finally, I'll take an Islamic perspective on imagination and how this might bring new insights in thinking around hermeneutics. Now, this will be more a cameo with figures and ideas rather than fully developed arguments, and it is more suggestive than prescriptive. So firstly, I have put a mid-COVID perspective into my title. And this speaks both to a workshop theme, but also to the situation that all of us in the globe find ourselves in. While vaccine rollout is happening quite rapidly in some places, at a slower pace in others it is yet to begin. But the fact remains that until we find a way to provide mass vaccination across the planet, we'll expect to see COVID remain a reality in all our societies. Now, one potent issue raised by the pandemic is the connection of COVID and prejudice. And we can think back to Susan Sontag's classic work on this, when she spoke of illness as metaphor. And the rise of anti-Asian prejudice, or we may better say the heightened visibility of anti-Asian prejudice in many countries, has highlighted the levels of misunderstanding and distrust. But also, we'll undoubtedly see ongoing effects in areas such as economic disparity, often hitting at the interstices of gender, race, and socio-economic deprivation that already mark out undue hardship. Now, dialogue may not seem the most pressing need for those affected by this, yet, unless we can improve communications and understanding and find better ways of living together, then further prejudice, hatred, and misunderstanding will fester. From a Southeast Asian context, this might draw upon Confucian social perspectives, meaning that we place the focus on communitarian thinking rather than on isolated individuals, which suggests that dialogue across our various group identities remains an imperative. And as the philosopher Li Xiang Lisa Rosen Lee has suggested, a hybrid feminist Confucian care ethic gives us a different way of thinking about political analysis, in which we extend filial care to all, even those different from us. Secondly, and drawing from my previous point, how can we rethink the ethics of dialogue? Buber and Levinas have provided classic texts here. But if we look at aspects of Asian thought, we will also see things differently. While I can only give some indications here, the Vietnamese Zen Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh has stressed, by rethinking and re-envisaging the traditional Buddhist principle of dependent origination, what he terms into being, the way that we all, humans and non-humans, including our environment, exist only always within complex webs of relationality. While Buber stressed our relationship to a thou rather than an it, and Levinas focused upon the other as our absolute ethical imperative, stressing especially the otherness of the other, Hahn's thought gives us a different emphasis. Rather than stressing the alterity of the other that we find with Levinas, Hahn asks us to see our interconnectedness to them. Both visions stress the ethical imperative of being before, in Levinasian terms, the face of the other. But instead of being before combining Buber and Levinas's terms here as thou other, as a distinct individual separate from us, we meet with Hahn what I will term an inter-other, not a separated, isolated monad apart from us, but by being human, a being with whom we are already connected in many and complex ways. Thus, our community and reliance on the inter-other, and their community and reliance on us, is stressed in a dynamic set of bonds that is not just to be before the face of this one other, but many and all inter-others, human and non-human. Thirdly, in Southeast Asia, many traditions meet, combine, and live together. And the next strand I will bring in comes from Islamic thought, in particular, how Ibn Sina may help us to think about the hermeneutics of dialogue. Ibn Sina, the imagination was a faculty of the soul that provides a bridge between the body, the senses, and the intellect. He saw it as a deeply creative thing, permitting us to extend what is already known, and he linked this to artistic creation, drawing from the notion of mimesis or imitation found in Plato and Aristotle. However, in Islamic philosophy, it has been argued that there is a unique role to the imagination, with it being an in-between realm, mediating between the spiritual or intellectual and material, and so contrasting with its usage in Western philosophy. It therefore has a transformative role in recreating afresh what is known by bringing together different concepts in original ways. Space does not permit me to develop on this in detail here, but if you use what I would term Gadamer's concept of the opening of horizons, Ibn Sina may give us new ways of thinking about and concepts for explaining how we create and recreate our understandings and concepts in a globalized world, and one where, under the impact of COVID, old ideas and ways of doing must be changed. Now, this is where I will wrap up, and I should stress this is not a conclusion, so I have at most hinted at various ideas without developing them fully here. And so I have perhaps opened a door to asking new questions rather than concluded by saying what the questions or the answers should be. And so I'm not shutting the doors with a conclusion. But I hope that these few humble thoughts will nevertheless be meaningful to at least some of you. Thank you.